Well, thank you. I'll introduce Giddy in a second. Tom Friedman, as you just heard, is not here. Tom May is well known for his book about the world being flat. What he learned the hard way is the trail wasn't. And as a result, sustained a shoulder injury. But I owe a lot to Tom. We were at Oxford at the same time. And I used to tell people that despite what they had heard, I went to Oxford on the Friedman Fellowship. And they said, well, what's the Friedman Fellowship? And I said, we had a weekly poker game, and Tom was a participant. And for me, it turned out to be a useful stipend for my years at Oxford. And when he hears about this, he'll be really angry that I said this. Trust me. With me today is Giddy Grinstein, who is the founder and head of the Reut, the Machon Reut, the Reut Institute in Israel, which has an important role in really thinking big thoughts about the nature of that society, that polity, as well as others. He's the author of this book, Flexigidity. And you get in it the inherent tension or balance between rigidity and flexibility. Well, we're going to be dealing with a lot of balances today, order and disorder paramount among them. We're not going to do an interview. We're going to do a conversation. We're going to bounce off of each other for about half the time, and then we will bounce off of you for about half the time. This will not be linear. Trust me, order and disorder is a useful place to begin for two reasons. For one, personally, my favorite book ever written about international relations was written by an Australian academic named Hedley Bull. And when I was at Oxford, Hedley was there as well. We didn't formally work together, we became very close friends. And Hedley wrote a book called The Anarchical Society. And again, contradiction. And his argument is history at any one time, international relations at any one time, is the balance between forces of anarchy and forces of society, between those who are fomenting disorder and those who are embracing order. And the purpose of diplomacy, as he saw it, was obviously to favor the forces of order. I find this the single most enduring and useful concept in the field, because at any one moment in history, you can look at the world and hold up this prism or lens or template and very quickly get both a snapshot of where the world is, and you can look at where we're coming from and get a sense of where we might be heading to. And in today's world, you've obviously got multiple examples of order, and as well as disorder. We tend to focus more on the disorder because they're the most dramatic and because we're worried about them, but there's also powerful forces of order out there in the relations between and among states and other actors. What I want to do, though, for this conversation with Giddy is also expand this not just at the international level, but to the domestic level. And that, again, within societies, we have elements of order and disorder. It's true of every society. And what's interesting is to drill down and ask what are the sources or drivers of order and disorder. And then particularly to look at systems and what systems tend to be best positioned, given their DNA, I guess you might say, to cope with inevitable pressures of disorder, but to make sure they don't get overwhelmed by it. And same thing as international. And another word for thinking about this is governance. At either the international level or the subnational level, which is what sort of entities and what are the characteristics of the entities that seem best suited to be orderly as opposed to be disorderly. Over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Richard, for stepping in. And when I was offered to be in a conversation with Tom Friedman here about what would be his coming book, The World is Fast. That's the name of World is Flat. Previous book, World is Fast. There were a few books in between. I thought to myself, it's too good to be true. But I never thought it would go that far. of him breaking his shoulder. But here we are today, and it's really a great pleasure. And I think this is actually a great starting point. I was initially reluctant to say a few words about my book, but Richard actually said, hey, it's the Aspen Ideas Festival, right? So let's share an idea here. And my argument in the title of the book, Flexigidity, is that the secret of the success of the Jewish people, of the resilience of the recurring prosperity and leadership of the Jewish people, is the way the Jewish society creates a hybrid between old and new, innovation and tradition, flexibilities and rigidities, and that's where the name came from, Flexigidity. So we basically have a society that is permanently managing order and disorder. There are areas in the Jewish society that are always declining, and when I speak about that, I'm not just talking about institutions, I'm talking about entire communities. Some people are saying that the Jewish community of Europe, European Jewry, is now at the end of a historical decline and has been going on for 150 years. And at the same time, you see Jewish communities rising. Okay, so the fastest rising Jewish community per capita today is actually in the Far East, in Hong Kong, in China. This is where you see the fastest growth per capita, and obviously also in the United States of America and in Israel. So we're talking about all these tensions between order and disorder, flexibilities and rigidities, and it's inherent to the survival of society. But the underlying theme of this whole conversation today was what you may want to call the change in the nature of change. And that means that there are many more players on the global playing field, and they're all interacting in a very, if you wish, aggressive way. And therefore, things are changing much faster, technologically, politically, economically, and so on. And that means that there is a tremendous pressure on each and every one of us, on every business that we're associated with, every nonprofit we're associated with, and on our societies, to do three things: to create new knowledge about the emerging world, to adapt, which means to change our values and priorities and patterns of conduct, and therefore let go of the old and embrace the new in this very delicate process. And one of the differentiating factors in the world today are in the adaptive capacity of societies or groups, if you wish, also of businesses. And those that have the adaptive capacity will continue to rise and thrive, and so on. And those that don't simply implode. So if you're a company, you go bankrupt or you're sold. But if you're a country, you may go to a civil war or to an economic crisis. And the living example that we can watch on the news right now is Greece. Their inability to adapt, the inability to respond to the changes. In this case, I think primarily the whole issue of transparency and accountability in the economy eventually leads to a moment of tremendous crisis that will affect millions of people.
You raised a point, because actually there's a tremendous debate in the business literature right now and it's a little bit around the writings of Clayton Christensen. And it's the question of adaptation, adaptability, creative destruction, Schumpeter, if you will.
Right.
But also where you push back, where you draw the line. I feel it profoundly because I'm lucky enough to head what you might call a legacy institution. Council on Foreign Relations was created nearly a century ago. We publish foreign affairs, so there's a sense of your place in history. And the tension whenever you run a legacy business or a legacy institution, and a country is a legacy institution when you think about it, is what do you try to preserve, and where do you change? Because too much change, you can destroy what made the place special and vital. Too little change, you become obsolete and you become vulnerable to being overwhelmed. What's your thinking about, because you've thought about this more deeply than I have, about how you try to get this balance right?
So I think the lessons that we can draw from the Jewish experience is that when a society is organized as what is called, and please forgive me for this language, small-scale network, which means it's a network of small units. And the basic unit of the Jewish society is the community. The Jews have a numerical answer to what is the smallest group of people that constitute a community. It's called the minyan. 10 men above the age of 13 are required in order to create a community.
It's 10 men, but 11 opinions.
Yes. And all these communities are interrelated. It's like a worldwide web of communities. And this is a most resilient structure that has proven its ability to evolve. And what is so interesting about this structure is that at the same time, it has forces of unity that keep people together, but tremendous incentives for adversity and diversity. So the way this process goes is that over here you have the new, the progressive voices, and they come up with new ideas. Some of these ideas will prove themselves over time, but many of these ideas are just bad, because obviously not every new idea is a good idea. But those ideas that over time prove themselves to serve the security and the prosperity of the community become custom and then law. On this side of the community, there are the conservative voices, and they say no, no, no to every innovation. But over time, they gravitate in the direction of those innovations that prove to serve the community. And that's how you have basically collective progress. So the Jewish answer to your question is decentralized power, decentralized authority, decentralized leadership. Let all these units compete, and ultimately, the whole system will progress. And if I want to say, if I can draw from that to America, the United States of America, that's why I believe that America is a kind of empire and a force that the world has not seen in history, because America is fundamentally organized as a small-scale network, fundamentally organized to limit the capacity of the central government, of the federal government. And this is why I deeply believe in the adaptive capacity of the United States of America.
It's interesting, one of the great debates that continues in American history, and you saw it as recently last week in the Supreme Court.
It was a big moment for the adaptiveness of America, whether you agree or disagree with the court. Just this moment of the whole system turning a corner on an issue is absolutely remarkable.
But some would also see it another way, which is the Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian traditions in America. And the question, if you look at particularly the same-sex marriage decision, whether the unit of governance in America ought to be the state, or whether the unit of government ought to be federal in the 14th Amendment or at the individual level. And this has been a recurring debate in American history. Listening to you, I was thinking of three other entities. One was a country that's not known for its decentralization, which is China. And so much of the debate about China is about China's inexorable rise. And I'm in the minority because I see China's inherent brittleness. And I wonder about how China will deal with the inevitable speed bumps of, say, slower economic growth, whatever. Another country, India, where it's very hard to get anything done. But its very messiness seems to me to be a source of surprising resilience. India may bend, but it probably won't break. China may not bend, but then it may break. The other entity that I'm sitting here thinking about as you're talking, Gidi, and it doesn't fill me with joy, is ISIS. That is, it's got certain elements of a state, but it's also got tremendous elements of decentralization. It also is a network. It also is something of a movement, which seems to me to suggest its enduring power. That people talk about, the president has often used language about destroying or eradicating ISIS. And listening to you reinforces my sense, not going to happen. That this is something that its very nature gives it a kind of staying power.
So I think that what is essential for long-term prosperity and resilience in the 21st century is a free market of ideas, is a free market among many units in society, in the economy, and in politics. And when you have all these elements, society, economy, and politics, I believe you're looking at a very resilient political entity. I think that exists in the United States of America, and all these debates that exist between the district level, state level, federal level, is just a sign of a very healthy society that debates these issues. Now, when you look at China, I think what the Chinese are probably moving forward is free market on the economic side. On the political side, they have a different system. Some people say it's a challenge to democracy. It remains to be seen. They do have a political system that has an inherent cycle of changing the leadership. So it's not that the leader of China will be there. I think every 10 years they have to move out.
2 5-year terms.
Yeah, it's a 5-year term. So basically they did create mechanisms of change. But for sure, when you're looking at authoritarian structures, they're much more vulnerable in a world that is changing very quickly. And the testament to that is what happened in the Arab world. A series of authoritarian regimes basically collapsed. And when you look at the collapse of Egypt, the people that grabbed power when Egypt collapsed were those that had the small-scale network societally, and that was the Islamic Brotherhood. And now we have some sort of a reaction in Egypt, but still, when you look at, when all the chips were down, who was able to seize the situation? It was those that had assets on the ground, on the community level. And that's a very interesting thing, but other societies in our world simply imploded. We're looking at, if you just look at the situation of Egypt, which is kind of astounding in terms of the challenges that they face, Libya, Sudan, Chad to a large degree, and Sinai, all around them, chaos. And that's what they're dealing with right now. Order against extreme disorder, almost 360 degrees.
Some other thoughts. I mean, this is kind of since this all happened relatively at the last minute, this is not a wildly structured or planned conversation, as you've already figured out. Is at the international level, listening to you, it leads me to think that what we traditionally think of as institutions and multilateralism can't succeed. I mean, the least successful multilateral institution I know is called the United Nations General Assembly. And you have universal representation of, at least for states, 190 plus states, and nothing ever gets accomplished there. And increasingly what states do is they bypass it. And you put together coalitions of the willing or informal sorts of groupings simply because the large formal level can't essentially keep up.
So again, I think useful, if you think about the implications of this radically accelerating pace of change, and let's say we roughly divide society into the government sector, the business sector, and the non-for-profit philanthropic sector. So the sector least capable of dealing with the pace of change is the government sector. And the UN more as an organization made up of governments, even more so. And indeed, I think you're seeing crises in the capacities of governments to govern in Greece, in Spain, in Belgium, in France, in Chile, even in the United States of America, in Israel, and so on. So you see the government sector declining all the time. At the same time, you see the business sector. So the business sector that has the inherent mechanisms of constructive destruction, Schumpeter, that you mentioned earlier, the business sector is rising. And is rising in power all over the world. But the more that it is rising, it is taking responsibility for the challenges that we face. So suddenly you're seeing all this discourse about business social responsibility. And so all these corporations that are taking, assuming responsibility, these new structures called the B corporations that are corporations that are serving also additional social goals. We're seeing new modes of investment, like impact investment and so on. And in between, you have the non-governmental, non-profits and philanthropy, and that's in between. And there too, you can spread the spectrum. There are non-profits that look a little bit like governments, and therefore they're probably in trouble. And there are non-profits that look much like businesses, and they are rising. And without getting into too many examples, we're seeing this spread. So relative to what you're saying, if we're looking at the global challenge of, for example, climate change. So if we used to think that the solution will come from governments, we probably need to rethink. But a lot of companies, a lot of corporations are beginning to take responsibilities on issues relating to climate change and to the environment and so on. And a lot of the change may come actually from that sector.
Maybe, but let me play devil's advocate here, because how do you get then questions of accountability? Governments may be slow to respond, but we have methods for holding, at least in principle, holding them accountable in democratic societies. But in a world of businesses, NGOs, multiple governments, individuals, wealthy individuals in particular, foundations and the rest, who holds whom accountable? How do we make sure that the whole is more rather than less than the sum of its parts?
So obviously this is a big question. One of the things we're seeing is that the ability of ordinary citizens to hold corporations accountable and governments accountable has also increased. The use of cell phones and their ability to share information, document information, the use of big data, that is, again, the ability to collect a lot of data points from all over the world, millions and millions of users, and to create and to extract new understandings about the condition and the direction of society, all that is there. So obviously you see a group like ISIS using all these technologies and all these opportunities in order to promote what we believe is evil in the world. But there's also a lot of good that can be made out of this whole enterprise. And just like I believe in any other period in history, technological developments have positive implications and negative implications. Some of them support order, some of them support disorder. And when you look at the map of the world today, it's very easy, you mentioned it earlier, to show the areas of order and the areas of disorder. So let's focus, for example, just so we understand scale, what is the space, if we can call it, of disorder? It begins with Liberia and Sierra Leone in West Africa, goes across Africa, all the way to Somalia and Sudan. So we have all that section of North Africa, Sinai, Iraq, Syria, let's leave Iran from the conversation for a moment, into Afghanistan. So we're looking at a space that spreads from Afghanistan to Sierra Leone, and then you have forces of disorder that are operating even in places like Europe. And just last week, we had 3 ISIS terrorist attacks within Europe. And then when you zoom in Europe, you have the same tension. Greece and Germany representing order and disorder within the European continent. And then you have the Ukraine. So you see this fault line all over the world. And that fault line actually brings together very strange bedfellows. So in the Middle East right now, you are seeing a very, I believe, powerful under-the-table axis between Egypt, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf countries, against challenges that you could frame them as challenges of disorder. So all this energy and all this transformation in the world is changing world politics. It's affecting economics. It creates a lot of opportunities and a lot of threats. And part, I believe, of the conversation is just so all of us walk away with a deeper understanding of what we're looking at.
I'm more aware of the threats. It seems to me that the general trend in the world is towards greater diffusion of capacity, if you will, centrifugal forces, and also increasing centrifugal forces of decision-making. I mean, you used the Middle East as an example. What the Saudis have done, say, in Yemen, that sort of thing. That, to me, is an example of a decentralization of decision-making. For lots of reasons, we're seeing less deferral to the United States. When countries joined up with the new AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that China was promoting, and the United States, in my view, unwisely said, don't do it. People said, thanks very much, we're going to do it anyhow. So we're beginning to see a world of decentralized power, diffuse power, greater autonomy in decision-making. I flunked science, but everything I know about science leads me to think that this is a world that's harder to manage. This is a world of greater entropy. And the challenge for people in my business, it seems, diplomacy, is to corral this. And I would think it's just going to, you got more entities with more autonomy, more actors that have real capacity. So the image, the great image of diplomacy, the Congress of Vienna, where Metternich and Castlereagh and Talleyrand and a couple of characters show up, they spend a few months, they make decisions. That's wonderful, but that's 2 centuries ago, and that seems like as different a planet as imaginable. This just seems to me potentially a far messier, a far more disorderly world.
I believe that a world that was really adamant against American presence and dominance and so on is probably a world that will yearn American presence. So the withdrawal of America is a central part of the story, and there is a vacuum is being filled by other forces. We all know that. But I also think that part of it is that what is inherent to America, and I'm also proud to say inherent to Jews, is that we have a mission to the world. And whether we are assuming it in one degree or another degree, the Jews have, one of the founding stories of Judaism is the responsibility to make the world a better place. So you take responsibility for people who are beyond your community. And I think this is one of the great things about America. Inherent to America is our ideas that are global and universal. And therefore, even if America right now is, some people call it retreat, some people call it, correction, whatever, ultimately, inherently, I believe that America has this global mission and America will rise to it. That's kind of a belief more than science.
I'm not sure for 2 reasons. One is there's no consensus in America about that. The most persistent debate in America most persistent debates, plural, about American foreign policy are, one is how much foreign policy to have, the balance between quote unquote guns and butter. And secondly, within foreign policy, to what extent should American foreign policy be a cause? And to what extent should American foreign policy be much more sober, essentially the realist tradition? And it's not clear to me. But second of all, even if you're right, and there was a bias towards activism on behalf of things, I would simply say it would be far more difficult to succeed because the nature of this world is that you've got far more places that could push back. With the diffusion of capacity comes the ability to push back. And look at Afghanistan and Iraq. We had at one point or another more than 2 million Americans served in one or the other. It was intrusive foreign policy making. And what do we have to show for it? We don't have a lot to show for it. And what I think that taught a lot of Americans is that in this world of diffuse capacity, no matter what our motives are, and I actually think our motives, to a large extent, were positive, and no matter what capacity we can bring to bear, there's limits to what we can do, given the dynamics of the 21st century world.
Right, but, well, it's kind of, I'm like an Israeli speaking about America. But I think what is inspiring about America is that America is driven by ideas that are universal and global, and they apply to every human being on this planet. That being said, my wife and I were just in South Africa in August, and we spoke to some people who are very close behind the scenes to the South African leadership. And their message is very interesting, and they're shifting in the direction of China. And I asked them, why China over America? And their answer was actually astounding. They said, in China, we see a legacy of taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We can't see it in America, and this is our problem in Africa. We need to take millions and millions of people out of poverty, and the Chinese have done it. So it's like one of those answers that a person gives them to you there and there without even thinking about it, and saying, wow, I never looked at it. It's a totally different perspective on global leadership. But still, what is beautiful, I believe, about the American system is it's decentralized, it's freedom, and therefore the evolution of ideas here, and the intellectual freedom, and the intellectual meritocracy that
let me push you. You may be right, but to the extent we are decentralized, to the idea it's a meritocracy, to the extent that America is a market, there's those who are losing. Not everyone is equipped, not everyone is succeeding for whatever reasons, whether it's education or values, 1,000 different reasons, legacies of prejudice. So here we have a situation in the United States where to me, I'll just make it clear, I think inequality is the reflection, not the cause. But I think we have major questions in this country now about mobility. And the American dream is increasingly more of an idea than a reality. And one of the things that worries me about the future of this country is that mobility is there's less lubricant, if you will, to mobility in America than there used to be.
So actually, this is a problem we're looking at very deeply also in Israel. Israel used to be the most egalitarian society among all developed nations up to about 30 years ago. And now we've caught up with the United States of America and with the United Kingdom as the most non-egalitarian society among all developed countries. Which means that in Israel, just like in America, zip code is more important than genetic code, which means where you're born and who's your family and what is the average income in your neighborhood is much more important than how talented you are. So that happens in Israel, it happens here. And here again, I think that this whole acceleration in the pace of change is very useful to understanding what's going on here. So on the one hand, we already spoke about the governments as victims in terms of their ability to actually serve people. So the ability of governments to effectively govern and serve the population is decreasing when the pace of change is accelerating. But another major victim of this change is the household unit. So if you think about it, 20, 30 years ago, people had, they went through the school system, they got an education, they got a profession, served them a lifetime, they retired. Then there is another generation that had 4, 5, 6 jobs in their career. And now the younger people will have 20, 30, 40, sometimes some people say 22 jobs on average within the span of a working life. So what we're looking at is dramatic instability at the household level. So again, just let's zoom in now on the needs of middle class, lower middle class people. How can you cope with this pace of change? How can you make ends meet when you have no job instability, where a lot of times you don't know where you're going to work 2 months from now, a month from now? We're moving into a fragmented labor market where people will not even know how much they're working next week. In this situation, how can you raise your children, right? And we could go on and on describing the challenges that are facing middle class, lower middle class families. And then there is the government. So what's the solution? And our argument, and that's what we're testing out in Israel, is that there's this middle layer called the community. And the communities are essential in order to support the households and to replace the vacuum created by the inability of governments. And this is where I believe Israel has a head start compared to all other developed nations, because we have a huge amount of societal knowledge about how to run communities from the legacy of Jewish life outside of Israel. And one of the key ideas that Judaism developed that is, I believe, very useful to a developed economy is that a community is always organized geographically around a core set of institutions. So let me explain, especially for all those people who are not Jewish in the room. If you go to the Jewish community of Buenos Aires or New York or Paris or Moscow, you'd find exactly the same set of core institutions. But no two Jewish communities are alike. When I say no two Jewish communities are alike, the Jewish community of Aspen and Denver are probably different, let alone Aspen and Buenos Aires. Okay, so no two Jewish communities are alike, but still same set of core institutions. Now, what I believe we can do is we can take this idea to a modern society and ask what are the core set of institutions that have to exist in every community, at least in Israel, rich and poor, north and south, Arab, Jewish, and then what are the freedom, the degrees of freedom that you can allow every community, and then empower the local leadership to take the decisions, and we believe they can do it probably more effectively than the central government.
I have 3 reactions to that, and then we're going to open it up. One is in the United States, we're seeing a slight version of that where more power is moving to municipalities, away from federal government, even state government. Municipalities are becoming one of the more interesting areas of governance. The second is, given the structural changes, is portability. The idea that increasingly, with the Affordable Care Act, you have an example, but increasingly because people are going to have careers of 20, 30 jobs, increasingly we have to divorce the safety net from employment. So safety nets are something you put in your pocket and you take with you, or you can pick up as you go along. And the third fundamental change is going to have to be education. Right now, 90% of education in this country is front-loaded. It's something you do when you're young, you finish by your early 20s, and then you've got 50 years to go. Inconceivable that front-loaded education will be enough to get you through the next 5 decades. So lifelong learning and making it available. If you have 20 job changes, you may have to have 20 visits to the intellectual filling station in order to get yourself ready. And making that a reality is going to be a real challenge for the society.
And we believe that will happen on the community level. That's what we're testing out today in Israel, in an ancient city of Tzfat, which is a poverty trap. And we're trying to take it out of poverty together with the local leadership, obviously. They are leading, we're just supporting. But I think that what is crucial is, think about if you are, again, middle class, lower middle class family. Today, there is, someone told me there is a coffee shop in New York that hires on 15-minute increments. Okay, so they have like a pool of workers, and let's say, based on a big data kind of system, program, they look at the weather. For example, this is a sunny day. They look at the hour of day, the day of the week, historical numbers, how much ice cream did they sell at the same day 3, 4, 5 years ago, and then they know how much ice cream they're going to sell today with amazing accuracy, and this is selling ice cream, right? Based on that, they hire the people.
Surge hiring.
Yes, surge, they hire people 15-minute increments. Now think about that you are now parent to 2 kids, and you need to respond to job availability on an hour's notice, day's notice. How can you raise children in a situation like that? And our answer is only if you are within a strong community. And a strong community is anchored in strong local institutions. So for us, essential part of the answer to the internal disruption is rethinking about what does a 21st century community looks like. Okay,
we've hopefully put a lot on the tables. And so, do we have microphones or not? We do have a microphone. I see you, Jen. Oh, we got 2 microphones. Yes, ma'am. You get the first. No, we'll play ping pong here with the. Keep them short. If you want to identify yourself, great. But please keep it short. We'll try to keep our answers short.
Hi, my name is Jolie Davis. I would like for you to expand upon what are the commonalities about the Jewish people in the different countries, and what are the big differences? Is it based on, and are the differences basically on language, on, what are the differences? It's very, very interesting. And why other communities or other groups have not been able to succeed as much?
Should we take one by one?
Yeah, take it one by one.
Okay, so first of all, if you go to every Jewish community around the world, first you'll have the keystone of the community is what is called the committee. In America, you call it federation. In France, you call it the CRIF. In Argentina, you call it AMIA. Okay, it's the committee of the community that takes care of collective needs. There will always be schools. There would always be a fund to take care of collective needs of the poor and the needy and so on. And then there are some functions that are essential for family life, for religious life, for community life, and so on. So you would always have the rabbi and the slaughter and for the food, for the meat, and you'll have mikveh. These are all Jewish concepts. Don't want to bore everybody, but essentially, what is important for everybody to understand is that there is a core set of functions that you can find anywhere, which means a Jewish person can plug and play Jewishly anywhere around the world, just joining the motions. And this is a very valuable concept, that you need to have a commonality, but there is a degree of freedom for every community to adapt to the local condition. Now, it's so trivial, right? But what happened in Israel is that until 1948, until the State of Israel was established, that's how our society was organized. There was no government. Then the State of Israel was established with a very big, assertive government. There were big challenges, and the government took away the power. And people got used to the fact that the government solves their problems, cradle to the grave. Again, without boring too much details, because in America you never had such a big government. Suddenly we're in a position where the government contracted, and people don't know what to do now with the power and the freedom is available to them. We're saying you have to give them the tools to reassume responsibility on the community level, on the city level, and on the regional level. And why this distinction is important? Because sometimes, for example, the city of Tzfat that we're dealing with in northern Israel, this is a city, it's just a tragedy, it's a poor city. It has all the assets to thrive, but it's a poverty trap. They're locked there. But there are some cities don't have the capacity to thrive. They don't have the assets. But regionally, the whole region can grow. So a lot of times, it's a challenge to decide what is the relevant framework, the region, the city, or the community. But when you do this analysis, you can then actually begin to drive development approach that brings together society and economy.
Okay, let's get sir with the purple shirt.
Yes, my name's Larry Gelman, and I had a question about the impact of the macro culture on the fungibility of these kinds of notions and approaches. Dana Weiss yesterday in a session on Iran said something about the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu won a campaign that focused only on fear and the need to be secure and to protect the country from its enemies, whereas Barack Obama ran a campaign that focused solely on hope and change and aspirations for the future. Now, each of them won in their respective communities. So my question is, does it matter or make a difference regarding the applicability of your notions as to whether or not the broader community is motivated more by hope for the future or by fear, or does it plug and play, to use your term, just about anywhere?
Well, I have a view on that. I'm not sure. Giddy's is where I've never been a great believer in the idea of electoral mandates. My feeling is electoral mandates, you define it for yourself the day after you win, and then you go out and govern. So you get elected on whatever basis you get elected. Lots of reasons people get elected. And then you've got to govern. And so I don't care if you think you had a mandate and you expect it's simply going to show up in your doorstep, you're kidding yourself. And you can win a squeaker election and you can govern effectively if you begin to pull together coalitions and you build public support for them and elite support for them and so forth. So my answer is, in a funny sort of way, it doesn't matter, the macro framing, because the day after the election, then it's a whole different situation.
I think that one of the, our team did extensive research on what is the secret of long-term prosperity. So we're talking about sustainable high growth. And the answer is that for high growth to be sustainable, it has to be inclusive, which means that the broad base in the population needs to participate in growth and benefit from growth. That being said, essential to long-term prosperity is also a political system that is organized toward pragmatism. So what is so interesting, I believe, about what is, to me, the one thing is worrying about the American system is that there are so many districts here that are not really competitive. They're red or blue. And when you're just a red or blue district, you're catering to your base. If the district was competitive and you win by moving to the center, then collectively America would have been much more pragmatic. So as a country, as someone who really admires America, I would like America not to be red or blue, to be purple. Same thing is about the Jewish people. The Jewish people is collectively pragmatic, out of many radicals, right? So it's kind of one of the great paradoxes of Judaism. We're like a bunch of radicals that produce a very pragmatic outcome. And the reason is that there is a society that encourages us to polarize positions, but the balancing out of all these positions actually create collective pragmatism. And this is where I also think that the political system in Israel is, basically speaking, geared toward pragmatism, because politicians, in order to be elected, need to speak to people broad base in society. Right now, we do have a problem. We need to fix it. I'm not saying we don't. We need to fix it, where it's easier for the prime minister to build a coalition to the base than to the center. With a small fix of our electoral system, the prime minister would have had an incentive to build a coalition across the aisle with the center-left party, and that's, generally speaking, a pragmatic political system that is conducive and essential for long-term prosperity.
Right. In the U.S., three ideas that are often suggested are open primaries like you have in California. Second of all, taking districting, congressional districting out of the hands of state legislatures, putting them in nonpartisan or bipartisan units. And then thirdly, rethinking the winner-take-all quality of the Electoral College. There's a lot about our design that reinforces a movement towards the end zones. And there's, if you will, political reform that would be profoundly consequential. The problem is, it's the contradiction. The very groups that see themselves favored by the status quo resist making the reform. So it's hard to build support for it. Sure. Wait for the microphone. You young lady. And then we'll get the gentleman with the green shirt next.
Gideon, your sense of...
You have to introduce yourself.
Oh, Joni Liebeck. Your sense of community and values and connection are the grassroots of success, I think. What happens in this country now is that you could spend half a day with Comcast, Verizon, CVS, and practically slit your own throat. You're talking, or the United Airlines, you're talking to computers, you can't get a person, the phone call is dropped. So how do you, if you're not beholden to the stockholders, how do you use your system over here where big business is beholden to the stockholders and it gets bigger and less local?
Well, the last thing I'll do is to speak about America as an Israeli. I can speak as an outside perspective. I can tell you in Israel, we made a list of what are the core institutions that have to exist in every community. Okay, so the list includes educational institutions, K to not just 12, beyond 12, the public parks, the community centers, the arts and culture, the sports frameworks, et cetera, et cetera. So, and our argument is that this is where you bring in civic leadership to take responsibility and to work with the professionals. True democracy in the 21st century, on our level, most of it will take place through your ability to affect the way the community center works and the way the school works and what's being taught and so on. And that's where you need to empower people. You're talking about a phenomenon that exists in Israel also. People are really frustrated with these big companies and so on, et cetera, et cetera. But our focus is elsewhere. And we're saying that there's such a vast space to operate in that we don't need to begin where there's already a blockage, because there's just an open space for us to make progress right now with no resistance.
I would have said the answer to your question is much more, it's called competition and regulation. Basically, you don't want to have large monopolies or close to monopolies. You want to have competition. And share, as a shareholder, I'm also sensitive to consumers and revenues. I want companies that succeed. Companies that alienate in a competitive environment won't succeed for long. Sir.
Malkoff, I'm a practicing clinical psychologist, and I have great faith in human beings able to change. With that said, in 1942, my ex-father-in-law, who was in Buchenwald and Auschwitz, probably never felt that he would ever vacation in Berlin in 2000. Equally so in 72, I never thought that I would go to Vietnam to vacation. I ask both of you, what are the chances of my granddaughter visiting Israel in 30, 40 years and then going to Tehran to visit?
Look, I think Iran, I'll let Giddy talk about what Israel's going to be like in 30, 40 years. I I haven't been, here's my expertise here. I've not been in Iran since 1978, but I'm an observer from afar. This is a real society. This is a real country. It has real political and social and economic dynamics. And it's hard not to be at times struck by its complexity. You have multiple centers of power, both within the government, in this unique religious political set of structures they have, but it's a real society. It's a real economy. You have a degree of decentralization. You have units other than the units at the top. So I think it's quite possible that you have serious dynamics in Iran, and it could be a very different place in X number of years. In the current debate about the nuclear agreement, I would simply say you can't base your opinion on the nuclear agreement on the hope that that's going to come about soon enough. So if nuclear weapons happen to become available, that by then Iran will be a different place. But if you're asking me, will Iran be this unique fusion of political and religious authority and with the current balances forever? No. It's too precarious, it's too competitive, it's personality dependent. So it's going to change, but no more than we could have predicted that the Soviet Union would be roughly a 7-decade experiment. We didn't know that. I don't think we can, here we are, what, 30 odd years, 35 years after the Iranian Revolution. I don't know if it's got another 35 years in it, more or less, but my hunch is this is not a permanent outcome. Indeed, Iran today is different than Iran 35 years ago. Even this Ayatollah, as powerful he is, has less authority than his predecessor. And it's quite possible that his successor will have less yet.
My framework for big picture, and then we'll speak, specifically about your question. The big picture is, I think, Paul Kennedy's ideas of overstretch. And one of the most dramatic things that happened, I believe, under the Obama administration is that Obama came in when America was heavily overstretched with two very big and expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And therefore, America was vulnerable. And America contracted, and some people say over-contracted, but now it's much more concentrated and focused. And within a certain period of time, some people say today, or it's your field, it may already be ready to spring back. Iran is exactly the opposite. Iran is now overstretched. Iran is now overstretched in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan. It's surrounded by tension. It's under sanctions, and so on. So Iran, paradoxically right now, may be more vulnerable than ever before, even if they're making progress to the bomb. Now, so basically what they have right now, they have a very expansive ideology that is maybe in a mismatch with the resources available to them. That's why I wouldn't be sure that, as you said, 35 years down the road, there'll be an Iranian regime. That being said, I think that the Jews and the Farsis have a legacy of good relations. Except for the last decades, we have a legacy of good relations. And one of the opportunities that may emerge out of the chaos of the Middle East is that it's almost sort of, I would say, natural for Israel to have good relations with the different minorities in the Middle East. So when you look at the breakdown of Syria and so on, ultimately down the road we may have, we may have new relationships that could not have existed before. So no one could know where your daughter could go or not go, but part of what will make Israel successful is the ability to identify these opportunities and seize them.
That's possible, but as has been pointed out in the Middle East, the enemy of your enemy can still be your enemy. Yes, sir.
Before you talked about order and disorder, you made the point that the UN is not a powerful organization. The world has created sub-organizations, of which perhaps NATO is the strongest. The UN tries to do good around the world, but actually we have foundations in the United States that try to conquer diseases and do good.
Right.
When you look at the UN, and you see its corruption as well as its ineffectiveness, would we be better off without a UN?
No, I don't think you're better off without it. I think we just have to be 2020 about its limits. The General Assembly is a place for universal participation, but it has no authority to do anything in real life. Some of the UN agencies do some good, some don't. but some do. If you didn't have it, you'd have to invent some form of it to do some of the functional tasks they do around the world in the area of health, in the area of peacekeeping, and so forth. The Security Council is the most significant organ within the UN, and again, if you didn't have it, you'd have to invent some place for the major powers to come together and talk things through. So my view is the UN is simply one, it's actually several examples or manifestations of multilateralism amongst a potentially infinite number. So I think it's a mistake to assume it's the main one or the best one or the only one. So I'm a great believer in forum shopping. And I worked for President Bush 41, when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. We're going to mark the anniversary of that this August 2nd, 25th anniversary. The UN turned out to be a pretty good place to do diplomacy because there was a degree of consensus among the major powers that that sort of aggression, as President Bush said, could not stand. On most other occasions, when the major powers don't agree or the right countries aren't represented at the UN, it's irrelevant. And you essentially bypass it. That was what was done at the time of the Serbian crisis. That the United States and the Europeans took things into NATO because you didn't have consensus. On lots of other issues, you create other ad hoc coalitions of the willing or even less formal things. So my view is not to be ideological, just to be practical. Go find the best place that you can get done what you think needs to get done. Find capacity and find agents, not just states. The other thing also, coming back to something Gidi said, increasingly you've got to find agencies that aren't states. I had a call one day from the UN Secretary General, and it was about 8-10 years ago, and it was to look at global health challenges, and he asked me if I would co-chair a meeting with him, and I said sure. And when we thought about who had to be in the room, it wasn't just ministers of health. We had to have the Gates Foundation and other foundations. We had to have some of the pharmaceutical companies. We had to have certain ministers of health, but not others, the World Health Organization and so forth, certain NGOs, Médecins Sans Frontières, and groups like that. And that's increasingly what multilateralism looks like. You go and you find out who has capacity, who has relevance, who has a will, and then you cobble it together. So a lot of it's going to be quite creative. It's in a sense putting together a network that makes sense for the challenge at hand. And I think that's probably the future of multilateralism.
Thank you. My name is Michael Silverman. A question for you, Gideon. As I think about this experiment with devolution to communities and a reduced role of the central government, maybe you could comment how you see it working in Israel with respect to its very substantial Arab minority that really doesn't identify with the Israeli government to begin with. Will there be equality of services and resources? How would that work?
So first of all, we believe it applies across all communities. All communities have schools. You know, one of the big debates our team had, whether synagogues are part of it, because in the for Jewish diaspora, synagogues are part of the community institutions. And our team, which is a small team, you can always debate our conclusions. We said synagogues cannot be part of it because it doesn't apply across societies, and the mosque and the synagogue are not the same, and so on. So we stuck with civilian institutions, and those institutions exist everywhere. That being said, I think that one of the major challenges, there is a distinction in Israel, and actually this week there is a very interesting case in Israel, and there's a distinction between the alignment of the Arab population with the government in general and the service and the government, where there's increasing alignment and rising leadership of Arab Israelis who are rising in the municipal system and rising in the government system. Part of the mission of our team in Reut is to push people into public positions. The most aggressive affirmative action today is about bringing Arab citizens into the government. We have an Arab member of our team, and he would be the easiest insertion into the government would be this guy, because the affirmative action in the government is so aggressive right now for Arabs. So you have a very mixed record. I want to say big picture. Under the British, before the State of Israel even came into being, an average Jewish household was making twice as much as an average Arab household. So it's very difficult to close these gaps. Look at America. Look at Australia and the Aborigines. If you look at a society, a minority that has been transformed over the last 40 years in the world, I would doubt that there is another minority that has leapt in terms of its basic human development indicators, life expectancy, infant mortality, education, and so on, than the Arab population in Israel. from 48 until today. That being said, a lot of work that needs to be done. But we are saying that actually if you think about a society as a network of communities that are resilient and prosperous locally, and the government is the one that underwrites this whole structure, A, by taxes, but also by allowing the regulation and giving the freedom, then you're creating a new hybrid of a national framework and local freedoms. And I think that that could work for the multiple minorities in Israel, not just the Arabs.
We've got time for one last question. The check shirt in the back. Sorry to describe people by their shirts, but that's about as good as I can do.
My name's Brad DeWeese. So you mentioned a couple of things. One, that the rest of the world looks up to the United States for the values that it espouses. And then you also told that fascinating story of your encounter with someone in South Africa who said that they look to China now as a way to pull people out of poverty. So my question is, which is more important to the rest of the world? And then the follow-on is, what does that mean for U.S. or Chinese world leadership?
What is more important? I'm sorry.
So values or the importance of pulling people out of poverty, money?
Well, I hate to think you have to make a choice. But obviously, societal, basis of a government's accountability is to provide security, to provide the basics of life. And so that has to be accomplished. And I think what's happened in China is quite impressive. But India has also taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And there's something of an intellectual debate going on about the best path and all that to do it. And I think it's too soon to make a judgment. I would like to think that we can make we're an example. Well, I guess I put it this way, that the example our society sets is a powerful foreign policy tool. And when we show we're adaptable, when we show that we can succeed, we're innovative. Our universities are obviously something that are highly admired around the world. So I think there's lots about this society that others want to emulate. There's also things that happen here that others don't want to emulate, whether it's the violence that the mayor of New Orleans was talking about earlier this week and other things. But I think that there's always competing ideas as to development. In recent years, you have the Washington Consensus versus more statist approaches, the so-called Chinese model. I think for a long time, it was the Western model. Then I think, particularly around 2008, the combination of the problems there and China's apparent success made people looking a little bit more at the authoritarian model. But watch what happens, if I'm right, and you might actually agree with me on this, if and when China hits major difficulties, I don't think you can necessarily want see a lot of people emulating China if you have massive protests and much slower rates of economic growth there. So I think this is part of the nonstop competition of ideas and examples for the nature of economies and the nature of societies. You get the last word.
Thank you. I believe that having a global calling elevates your society. And the reason it elevates your society, it's not just ethically and morally. The moment there is a dramatic gap between the resources that are available to you and what you're trying to achieve, this is a tremendous boost for innovation. So if you look at the vision of Jews being a light unto the nations, such a small people, such a huge challenge. Jews created the mechanisms to repeatedly offer leadership to humanity. It's not a coincidence. It just happens over and over again because there are the societal structures that allow it to happen. I believe that one of the reasons of success of Zionism, that from day one, and we're talking 1860, 20 years, 30 years before Herzl even stepped onto the stage, Zionism envisioned a society that will contribute to humanity. And that stayed all along. And until today, it's part of the discourse in Israel. So you could say, and everybody could say, you're far from it, you have a lot of problems, you have a lot of issues, and that's all correct. But the fact that you have this North Star that pulls you forward and elevates you, pushes your innovation, and so on. And I think that this is unique to America. Even if America right now is reorganizing and recalibrating and taking care of deficit, America has a message to the world. And that will elevate America over and above all other forces that have basically a message from them. By the way, the Soviet Union had a message to the world. The system was not aligned to it, but it was there. And I think a great example is, everybody speaks about the moonshot of Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, to go to the moon and what it created to American science and so on. But one of the most inspiring documents, I think it's 3 pages, that I ever read is the George Marshall speech at the commencement.
Most famous commencement speech ever given. I'll give him.
Yeah, the commencement of Harvard University in 1945, right?
47, was it?
45,
47.
when he actually articulated the Marshall Plan.
It was 47.
So that wasn't about military power. It was just about a big vision of what the world could be, and then America stepped up and put the resources behind it. And until today, I think the hundreds of millions of people, in one way or another, should be very grateful to America about that.
Which brings us back to Greece. Anyhow, we've done our best to live up to the idea that this is the Aspen Ideas Festival. You had an idea merchant here, so I want to thank Gideon. I want to thank all of you for being with us for this hour.
Thank you very much.